Good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we've been reading a beautiful book, Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship by Rabbi Meir Soleveichik. Excellent work. Yesterday, we read about Manasseh ben Israel and Benjamin Disraeli, unique characters leading up to the modern era. Very influential statesmen for sure. Challenges they each faced in their lives made them the men they were, for sure. But today, let's just jump right in. We're on chapter 8, which talks about Theodore Herzl. So let's dive right in. Welcome, Sheila. In January 1904, Theodore Herzl, the most prominent representative of the worldwide Zionist movement, entered the Vatican in Rome for a personal and private audience with Pope Pius X. Welcome, Explore Tanakh, the head of the Catholic Church and the most famous Christian leader of his time. Herzl was hoping to receive, if not an expression of support for Zionism, at least a statement that the Church did not oppose it. But the pontiff's disappointing reply, as later transcribed by Herzl in his diary, was as swift as it was decisive. We cannot give approval to this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. The soil of Jerusalem, if it was not always sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus as the head of the church. I cannot tell you anything different. The Jews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Jewish people. Wow, Pope Pius X. Although definitely not what Herzl had hoped to hear, Pius X's response, consonant with the Church's long history of suppressionist preaching and doctrine, should not have come as a surprise. In the end, it reflected a traditional Catholic interpretation of biblical passages related to the Jewish people's exile from and promised return to the ancient land of Israel. By common consent of most church theologians, all predictions in the Hebrew prophets concerning the Jews' ultimate restoration to Zion were to be read, not literally, but as allegorical reference to the second coming of Jesus. It's just the way, their aberrant salience distorts. And the glorious eschatological future of the church itself. But if the Pope's refusal to support Zionism was not surprising, more surprising was the approach adopted by Herzl in replying to it. The return of the Jews to the Holy Land, Herzl urged at their meeting, should not be seen by the church as having any religious or theological implications at all. Rather, it was only a political remedy for the Jews' present-day sufferings. I said, he recalled in his diary, that the Zionists' point of departure had been solely the distress of the Jews and that we desired to avoid the religious issues. To this, the Pope replied in turn, yes, but we and I, as the head of the church, cannot do this. There are two possibilities. Either the Jews will cling to their faith and continue to await the Messiah, who for us has already appeared. In that case, they will be denying the divinity of Jesus, and we cannot help them. Or else they will go there to Palestine without any religion, and then we can be even less favorable to them. After a bit more discussion, Herzl sought once again to focus on the domain of the political and the pressures of the moment. Here is his rendition of the ensuing give and take. Herzl: but, Holy Father, the Jews are in terrible straits. I don't know if your holiness is acquainted with the full extent of this sad situation. We need a land for these persecuted people. Pope Pius says, does it have to be Jerusalem? Herzl says, we are not asking for Jerusalem, but Palestine, only the secular land. We cannot be in favor of it, Pope Pius responded. Herzl persisting, does your holiness know the situation of the Jews? Pius says, yes, from Mantua days, Jews lived there, and I have always been on good terms with Jews. Only the other evening, 2 Jews were here to see me. After all, there are other bonds than those of religion, courtesy and philanthropy. These we do not deny to the Jews. Indeed, we also pray for them that in their minds be enlightened. Indeed, the Pope suggested there was a long history of Jewish minds being enlightened, for he informed Herzl on the very day of their meeting the church was celebrating the feast of an unbeliever who, on the road to Damascus, became miraculously converted to the true faith. Having thus invoked no less significant a figure than Paul the Apostle, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus, Pius concluded their colloquy with these terse words: "And so, if you come to Palestine and settle your people there, we shall have churches and priests ready to baptize all of you." Thus ended the meeting. 6 months later, on July 3rd, 1904, Herzl died at the age of 44. Shalom, Ashley. But despite his failure to win over the Pope, the story of their meeting cannot but evoke some of the sheer wonder that was Herzl's own life, career, and vision, and his Herculean exertions in the furtherance of that vision. For this was a man who only 10 years earlier had never been truly affiliated with Judaism or the Jewish community at all, but who now stood as the preeminent and universally acknowledged representative of an organized movement that had catalyzed minds and spirits throughout the Jewish world. Prior to Herzl's entry on the historical scene, there had been Zionist writings and Zionist groups and pioneers, but it was he who understood that only as a political organization could the movement truly succeed. In no time, through the publications of his small book, The Jewish State, from 1896, and the sequence of Zionist Congress that he proceeded to muster, convene, and orchestrate, he emerged as the movement's supreme representative and public face, a dominating presence who could enter palaces and parliaments to traffic with world leaders on behalf of the Jewish people and the dream of a Jewish state, the same dream about which he would famously proclaim, "If you will it, it is not a dream." This tremendous achievement, so unlikely and so fundamentally mysterious, has been deftly summarized by Rick Richmond. He came seemingly out of nowhere. At the beginning of 1895, no one would have predicted that the 35-year-old literary editor of Vienna's New Freie Press would propose the formation of a Jewish state, present the idea to London's Jewish elite, publish his historical pamphlet, The Jewish State, establish the political, financial, and intellectual institutions for a state in waiting, negotiate with emperors, kings, dukes, ministers, the Pope, and the Ottoman Sultan, hold 6 Zionist congresses, attracting hundreds of delegates from more than 20 countries and regions around the world, their numbers increasing each year, produce 2 remarkable diplomatic achievements that would set the stage for the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and then die less than a decade after he began. The Mystery of Theodor Herzl. That's written from Mosaic, January 4th, 2021. Indeed, before coming to the Vatican, Herzl had been traveling across Europe and throughout the Ottoman Empire to meet with the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne, ministers of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, the King of Italy Victor Emmanuel III, and many other statesmen of various ranks. And all of this is not even to speak of the depth and breadth of his impact on the dormant national sensibilities of the Jewish people themselves, an achievement whose cardinal significance was captured by the Israeli diplomat Yaakov Herzog in a 1960 talk on the centenary of Herzl's birth. The State of Israel was born as a viable entity in 1948, but the Jewish people recognized it in 1897 at the First Zionist Congress. In Jewish consciousness, it was then that the epoch of renewal, statehood, and political independence began. In inaugurating this epoch, in stirring Jewish consciousness to a recognition of its reality and destiny, in fashioning the tools whereby this destiny was to be fulfilled, Theodor Herzl made the outstanding contribution. Architect and leader, statesman and visionary, his memory and his statements are lastingly enshrined in the foundations of renewed statehood. So there you go. Great history on the background of Jewish statehood, for sure. This is very true historically and true of Herzl himself as the author of a political analysis of the Jewish problem and of a groundbreaking program for its solution. Herzl did not seek above all to be a purely political actor on the world scene, but the impact of his life, reverberating to this day, has been anything but purely political. The state of Israel is indeed a partial fulfillment of his dream. Partial because anti-Semitism has far from ended, and the state of Israel itself has been a fixed target of it. Also, whereas Herzl originally preached the possibility of Jewish political normalization, the state of Israel embodies something else, the wholly unique and miraculous partial fulfillment of the millennial dreams of deliverance on the part of the masses who rallied to Herzl's call. On this point, too, Yaakov Herzog's words are eloquent and insightful. Herzl arrived at the concept of political Zionism in an attempt to find a rational solution to the dilemma of Jewish survival as it appeared to him in Europe at the end of the 19th century, when he spoke and he wrote to the Jewish people, attaining a normal status among the nations of the world. But for the masses who were gripped by his message and acknowledged his leadership, the goal was not normalcy. It was redemption, that indefinable feeling and urge that had remained inviolate in their innermost souls down the ages. Herzl spoke in terms of conventional political parlance. They answered him in terms of immortal prophecy, undying faith, and historic destiny. From this perspective, there is, I will argue, reason to include Herzl as one who, in his own innermost soul, came to share that same indefinable and inviolate feeling, and to reflect the influence upon himself of his people, undying faith, and historic destiny. To approach him from that angle will thus involve us less in studying the moments of political activism in his life, stunning through these certainly, though these certainly were, than in considering two of his most important but utterly disparate pieces of writing. The one that changed Jewish politics forever, and the other an autobiographical fable in which he came closest to divining the nature of the Jewish faith. Interesting. Theodor Herzl was born in 1860 to assimilated parents in Vienna. He studied law at the city's university, earned the degree of Doctor of Laws in 1884, entered 5 years later into a marriage that would always be difficult, and then in 1891 became the correspondent in Paris for the New Free Press, Vienna's leading newspaper. In 1894, having become preoccupied with the issue of anti-Semitism, he wrote a play, The New Ghetto, dramatizing his thesis that European Jews, having ostensibly been offered equality in Western Europe through the widespread enactment of bills of emancipation, were not only still unfree, but also increasingly the victims of a burgeoning anti-Semitism. No doubt most personally painful to him was the rise and sweeping popular success of an openly anti-Semitic political party in his home city of Vienna. In Paris, he was now tracking the trial and conviction for treason of Alfred Dreyfus, an entirely innocent Jewish military officer, events accompanied in the French press by open and viciously anti-Jewish agitation. In this atmosphere, Herzl turned to writing what would become the most influential political pamphlet in Jewish history. In The Jewish State, addressing himself to his fellow Jews as much as, if not more than, to Gentiles, he crisply sets out his credentials for undertaking his self-assigned mission, described and analyzed in The Life-Threatening Dilemma. Faced by Europe's Jews, assertion and possession of a solution to their fate, and laid out a plan of action. I believe that I understand anti-Semitism, which is really a highly complex movement. I consider it from a Jewish standpoint, yet without fear or hatred. I believe that I can see what elements there are in it of vulgar sport, of common trade jealousy, of inherited prejudice, of religious intolerance, and also of pretended self-defense. I think the Jewish question is no more a social than it is a religious one, notwithstanding that it sometimes takes these and other forms. It is instead a national question which can only be solved by making it a political world question to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the World Council. Emphasis added. The ensuing argument is complex, but it can be reduced to its constituent parts. Everywhere, Herzl wrote, the Jews, though striving to be good citizens, were still seen to be a people apart. Therefore, the more they succeeded economically or socially, the greater the jealousy and hostility they inspired. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities while also preserving the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land where the Jews had already had experience of suffering. What then? Paradoxically, Herzl argued, hatred and persecution had actually helped to intensify the Jews' sense of themselves as one people, as we've seen with this latest October 7th issue. In that union, they had found a source of great strength, prospectively great enough indeed for them to surmount the jealousy and the hatred of others through the practical solution of becoming a people fully and physically apart. We are, he wrote, strong enough to form a state, and indeed a model state. We possess all human and material resources necessary for the purpose. Were the Jews to attain that goal specifically by moving to a country of their own, surely the nations of Europe would applaud and cooperate. Hence the practical course. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. Nor was this an outlandish or fanciful idea in an era when, after all, many other new states had come into being. The creation of a new state, Herzl explained, is neither ridiculous nor impossible. We have in our day witnessed the process in connection with nations which were not largely members of the middle class, but poorer, less educated, and consequently weaker than ourselves. Indeed, there was reason to expect help, as the governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism, grateful to be relieved of their Jews, would be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. The pamphlet's message spread like wildfire, turning Herzl into a quasi-messianic figure throughout the Jewish world and giving birth in 1897 to the first Zionist Congress. True, his was not the first effort of its kind to stir Jewish hopes and mobilize a Jewish will for national regeneration, but it had something that other Zionists' writings lacked. Daniel Polisar, commenting in Mosaic on Rick Richmond's The Mystery of Theodor Herzl, pointed usefully to three differences between Herzl's approach and the argument for a Jewish auto-emancipation laid out by the Russian Zionist activist Leon Pinsker in an earlier groundbreaking work by that name. First, where Pinsker dwelled on the widely dispersed and fragmented nature of Jewish existence in the diaspora, Herzl insisted positively and forcefully, we are a people, one people. Second, where Pinsker gave only a scant idea of how a Jewish state could actually be established, Herzl devoted most of the Jewish state to expounding not the why, but the predictable how. Very important. Third, unlike Pinsker, Herzl projected optimism. If you will it, it is not a dream. He wrote, and the fulfillment of that dream lay not in some far-off future, but on the near horizon. Polisar is exactly right, and to complete the picture, we might also take notice of elements that were lacking in Herzl's treatment, or that he got wrong in his first hope-filled iteration of the Zionist case. Thus, to Herzl in 1896, it was axiomatic that just as Jewish powerlessness had facilitated and fed anti-Semitism, so Jewish empowerment would once and for all put paid to that old scourge. The Jews, normalized and settled in their own state, would have few, if any, enemies to speak of, or at least none of the radically committed and violent kind. They would therefore have little need for a standing army. As for those Jews who preferred to remain behind, they would no doubt diminish in numbers and soon disappear altogether. Though Herzl does add that I think the Jews will always have sufficient enemies, such as every nation has. In fact, however, as we are now all too aware, though many other nations do also have enemies, few nations, if any, have been subjected to anything like the repeated attempts by force of arms to wipe the Jewish state from the face of the earth, and none has drawn anything like the vicious opprobrium regular cast on this member state of the United Nations. A state whose right simply to exist was impugned in the notorious 1975 Zionism equals racism resolution of that body's own General Assembly, a nation obsessively condemned by Western elected officials and by the tyrannical regimes in control of the UN's rispily named Human Rights Council. And now we see this today with UNRWA. A model democracy sanctimoniously vilified in the putative, enlightened halls of European and American universities. Not only has anti-Semitism not ended, it has focused with intensity on the very state designed by Herzl to be the remedy for that plague, and hence in a position to forego the need for a powerful army to defend it. Next, Herzl did understand that the Jews were indeed one people. Such, in fact, was his rallying cry, but at this stage in his thinking, he misstated what exactly had made them into one people. Whether we like it or not, he wrote, we are now and shall henceforth remain a historic group with unmistakable characteristics common to us all. We are one people. Our enemies have made us one without our consent, as repeatedly happens in history. Does the anti-Semite make the Jew, as French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would independently and controversial rephrase Herzl's formula in 1946 essay? In fact, it was not their enemies who forged the Jews into one people without our consent. Biblical Israel had become a nation through the covenant at Sinai, an event that united the wandering escapees from Egypt through a collective pledge of loyalty to the God of Israel, who had redeemed them from slavery and chosen them as his own. That same pledge would also serve them as an admonition and a perpetual reminder once they entered the land and took on the trappings of a polity. They would continue to answer to a higher calling than the state itself. The same calling would later preserve them as a people even after they lost their state, and that, in the fullness of time, would enable them to establish their state once again. But, to put it bluntly, Jewish experience has repeatedly demonstrated that, as a people, Jews are not and never will be normal. They are defined not by their enemies, but by their chosenness. This point allows us to ponder another, related blind spot in the vision of the great Zionist seer, a superficially small but highly indicative one. Neither in the Jewish state nor in his utopian novel Alt New Land, The Old New Land, 1902, did Herzl grasp the centrality of the Hebrew language to the oneness of the Jewish people. Here is how he deals with the issue in envisioning the future Jewish state. We cannot converse with one another in Hebrew. Who among us has a sufficient acquaintance with Hebrew to ask for a railway ticket in that language? Such a thing cannot be done. Yet the difficulty is very easily circumvented. Every man can preserve the language in which his thoughts are at home. Switzerland affords a conclusive proof of the possibility of a federation of tongues. But Israel is not Switzerland. It is not a normal nation, reveling in its safety and neutrality. with no need for a standing army and happily accommodating a plurality of languages. Quite the opposite. It is a nation resurrected after a Holocaust perpetuated by one European power and abetted by tolerated by others, defiantly facing throughout its existence the determination of others to destroy it, and testifying to its resurrection by speaking a resurrected language. It is, in short, a nation that should not be, and yet it triumphantly, creatively, resiliently, heroically is. Even a visionary of Herzl's caliber could not conceive of the sheer extent of the miracle that he himself would crucially help bring about. There were then lacunae in Herzl's thinking and in his powerful and present perspective. But, as I hinted at the start, there was also more to the vision of this mysterious Jewish statesman than we have noticed till now. Yaakov Herzog was right to draw a dichotomy between Herzl's concept of political Zionism, his drive to achieve for the Jews a normal status among the world's nations, and the joyous reaction to this idea on the part of the Jewish masses, who were gripped by his message and who acknowledged his leadership, but for whom the goal was not normalcy, it was redemption. That indefinable feeling and urge that had remained inviolate in their innermost souls. Only one thing is missing from this acute perception by Herzog, namely, the grip on Theodor Herzl's own innermost soul that would in turn be exercised by that same tidal wave of popular emotion. By December 1897, 3 months after the First Zionist Congress, the effect on him would be registered in The Menorah, a semi-autobiographical tale that forms at once a correction and a counterpart to the Jewish state. The protagonist of this fable-like story is a European Jewish artist who, like Herzl, has long embraced the cause of assimilation, but who lately, all of a sudden, has developed the urge to recapture a key abandoned part of his Jewish identity. The trigger for this personally transformative turn, we read, lies all around him in the recrudescence and intensification of anti-Semitism, that age-old hatred. Here is how the narrator sketches the background. The artist had long ceased to trouble his head about his own Jewish origin or about the faith of his fathers. When the age-old hatred reasserted itself under a fashionable slogan, like many others, our man, too, believed that this movement would soon subside. But instead of getting better, it got worse. Although he was not personally affected by them, the attacks pained him anew each time. Gradually, his soul became one bleeding wound. Tracing this wound, a secret psychic torment, to its source, namely his Jewishness, the artist now undergoes a change that he might never have experienced in better days because he had become so alienated from Judaism. The epiphany is as salvific as it was wholly unexpected. He began to love Judaism with great fervor. True as a full-grown adult, he had gone to many years disengaged from Jewish knowledge or practice to feel capable of making the full return to Judaism that he acknowledges would be the correct solution to his agony. But the artist thinks the next generation, provided it were given the right guidance early enough, would be able to do so. He therefore tried to make sure that his own children, at least, would be shown the right way. He was going to give them a Jewish education from the very beginning. Having resolved to induct his children into Jewish practice, the artist next decides to focus on Hanukkah, the festival which for centuries had illuminated the marvel of the Maccabees with the glow of candles. This would be the occasion on which to provide his children with a beautiful memory for the future. And so, on Hanukkah, his observance of the ritual commences. In the days that followed, he could hardly wait for the evenings, which became ever brighter. Candle after candle was lit in the menorah, the Hanukkah candelabrum, and together with his children, the father mused upon the little lights. At length, his reveries became more than he could or would tell them, for his dreams would have been beyond their understanding. Herzl does not disclose to his readers the contents of those dreams beyond a child's supposed understanding. But there are hints throughout the story, and especially in its conclusion, to which we shall return. But meanwhile, we must interrupt the plot summary for a question. What exactly in Herzl's personal experience might have sparked this literary device of Jew driven by anti-Semitism not to take flight from the stain of his peoplehood, but counterintuitively to conceal a great love not only of Jews, but of Judaism itself? An obvious answer suggests Herzl's own recent and emotional stirring encounters with East European Jews, many of them fervently traditionalists at the First Zionist Congress. But closer to home and perhaps more revealing, I would also point to the influence of a turbulent personal friendship that had begun 2 years earlier with one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in Herzl's home city. The friend was Moritz Gudman, the chief rabbi of Vienna, who in 1895 had become enormously excited by Herzl's Zionist project and in December of that year had gone to visit him, only to discover that the Jew upon whom he had placed his nationalist hopes had in his home a Christmas tree. Herzl's description of this incident in his diaries is a show of bravado that simultaneously betrays his chagrin and embarrassment. I was just lighting the tree for my children when Gudman arrived. He seemed upset by the Christian custom. Well, I will not let myself be pressured, but I don't mind if they call it the Hanukkah tree or the winter solstice tree. This was the still thoroughly assimilated Herzl, at the very moment when he was paradoxically devoting all of his strength to the Zionist project. Rabbi Gudman, for his part, would never forget this early meeting. Much later, in his unpublished memoirs, he would state that after seeing the Yuletide decoration, our conversation in the presence of the Christmas tree was rather cumbersome, and I soon took my leave. As far as I can recall, we paid no more visits to each other's homes. Over the next 2 years, the two men also fell out over Zionism. By 1897, Rabbi Gudman had published an attack on Herzl's project, to which Herzl responded in their final conversation, which took place on the streets of Vienna. The rabbi depreciated the Zionist cause and spoke passionately of his fixed intention to remain in Europe, precisely for the purpose of fighting and defeating anti-Semitism. How, the rabbi demanded caustically, could anyone expect him to do otherwise? I should go away from here, where the name of the Jew and all those who bear it are constantly abused and cursed. I should clear the way for our enemies in order to grow vegetables in Palestine. No, not even 10,000 horses could drag me away from here until I experience my revenge and satisfaction at the downfall of the anti-Semites. Rabbi Gudman died in 1918. In November 1938, his synagogue would be destroyed in the violent anti-Semitic riots of Kristallnacht and never rebuilt. Herzl wrote the menorah a few months after their falling out and public dispute. If in 1895 he had jokingly suggested renaming his Christmas tree as the Hanukkah tree, now 2 years later he was extolling the Hanukkah menorah as the definitive symbol of the Jewish people. The thought cannot help suggesting itself that he was writing out of remorse over his previous moments of shame and asserting his determination to redress his errors by indicating a love of Judaism in the next generation. When the menorah was published, thousands around the world took it as a sign of a fundamental turn in Herzl's part of religiosity. According to his colleague Jacob de Haas, who served as the secretary of the First Zionist Congress and would later become active for the Zionist cause in America, Herzl had indeed undergone a turn in his thinking about the Jewish people. But apart from lighting the menorah with his children, he did not take on religious observance. Rather, as de Haas put it, the romance of the idea, as well as of his own life, had grown. He had acquired the poet's mysticism, but this inner light did not turn toward religiosity. Perhaps so, but the story does indicate that Herzl had indeed begun to ponder the puzzle, or, better, the wonder of Jewish endurance. The same wonder attested to millennia earlier in the miraculous 8 days of light produced in the ruins of the temple by a little flask of oil, with its radically insufficient quotient of fuel. In the story, we learn that the artist has become fixated especially on the physical form of the ancient menorah, which had given him food for thought. When had the primitive structure of this candelabrum first been devised? Obviously, its form had originally been derived from that of a tree. The sturdy stem in the center, 4 branches to the right and 4 to the left, each below the other, each pair on the same level, yet all reaching the same height. A later symbolism added a 9th, shorter branch, which jutted out in front and was called the shamash, or servant. With what mystery had this simple artistic form taken from nature been endowed by successive generations? Taken from nature, obviously derived from the form of a tree. What can we say about this foray of Herzl into botanical genealogy? Might the ancient golden menorah in the Temple of Jerusalem really have been modeled on a plant species? As it happens, yes, not long after his death, Herzl's aesthetic hunch would be confirmed by Ephraim and Hannah Haruveni, a husband and wife team of botanists who, galvanized by the Zionist movement that Herzl had helped to broaden and grow, emigrated from Russia to the Holy Land in 1912. Obsessed with identifying the plants mentioned in the Bible, the couple were also convinced that the original menorah was indeed meant to serve as the artistic embodiment of a tree, and they were therefore particularly intent on finding a plant that could have served as its inspiration. Their search was rewarded when they came upon a genus of the salvia sage family that was native to the Holy Land, and that in fact had been named Salvia Palestina by a 19th century English botanist. With its slim, extended branches, their ends adorned with white flowers, the salvia does indeed resemble a menorah, a bush ablaze with light. In Herzl's story, the artist calls it a tree with slender branches, its ends opened up like calyxes, the protective petals surrounding the budding flower, and it was these calyxes that were to hold the candles. Coincidentally, an entry in Wikipedia agrees the plant's 12-inch stems grow candelabrum-like at the top. Perhaps unintentionally, then, did Herzl, in the midst of his botanical reflections, also happen upon a hermeneutical insight that would have done credit to a rabbinic commentator, namely that the menorah itself was meant to evoke a burning bush, perhaps even the burning bush, the bush that burned but miraculously was not consumed, a reminder in turn of the encounter at Sinai, and thus of the indestructible nature of the Jews. If God, on the eve of the Exodus, chose to reveal himself in this manner, the point I would suggest is that even more than the miracles that were about to unfold, the revelation at Sinai, the giving of the law, the entry into the land, it is this eternal fire that throughout the ages has been the medium by which the divine is to be discovered. At length, when we read in Herzl's The Menorah, the artist's reveries became more than he could or would tell his children, for his dreams would have been beyond their understanding. Indeed so. In this same connection, and as the final point before returning to the menorah and its dramatic conclusion, we should also be mindful that in our own time, even as it has witnessed a drastic rise in anti-Semitism in both Europe and the United States, and as Israel has become an object of opprobrium for some non-Jews, among millions of others, the Jewish state continues to inspire support, admiration, and enthusiastic affection. This is measurable both statistically, for instance, in the solidly pro-Israel sentiments voiced by ordinary American citizens in survey after survey of public opinion, and in the actions of millions of Christians around the world who celebrate the rebirth of the Jewish nation, make a point of visiting it, and see it as divinely blessed event in human history and a reinforcing sign of the eternal truths of faith in today's secular world. In the words of Robert Nicholson, a remarkable Christian leader and the founder and president of the Philos Project, anti-Semitism almost always grows from a resentment of chosenness. The idea that the Jewish God appointed one nation, the nation of Israel, to play a special role in history. To fight anti-Semitism, Nicholson argues, we need to understand its spiritual sources. This isn't just old hatred or racism. It is a grand anti-myth that turns Jewish chosenness on its head and assigns to the people of Israel responsibility for all the world's ills. For that very reason, he concludes, the best response to anti-Semitism isn't anti-anti-Semitism, it's philo-Semitism, love of the Jewish people. Moreover, although this especially ardent form of philo-Semitism has largely been confined to Christian evangelicals, lately a number of Catholic scholars, theologians, and clergymen have also begun to speak openly of a specifically Catholic Zionism and to match their speech to action. Thus, under the papacy of Pope John Paul II, who openly aspired for closer relations with Jews in a Jewish state, formal diplomatic ties between the Vatican and Israel were established in 1993. More recently, a particularly forceful voice has been that of Bishop Cardinal Schönborn, the Catholic Archbishop of Vienna and one of the Church's most important theologians. On a 2007 visit to Israel, Cardinal Schönborn answered a question about the meaning of the land of Israel to Christians by stressing the doctrinal importance not only of recognizing the Jewish connection to the land, but also of ensuring that Christianity's identification with the Jewish Bible not lead to a usurpation of Jewish uniqueness. Only once in human history did God take a country as an inheritance and give it to his chosen people. The cardinal said, as reported in the Washington Post, adding that Christians should rejoice in the return of Jews to the Holy Land as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Thus have many outside Judaism come to see exactly what Herzl had not necessarily sought to embrace for himself, namely the traditional and highly particularistic arc of the Jewish story as enunciated by the biblical prophets: chosenness, exile, return, and restoration. In the concluding section of the Menorah, Herzl's protagonist, now apparently a profoundly committed Jew, depicts the ritual of kindling the candles of the Hanukkah as a metaphor for the awakening of his people's national and Zionist commitments. The occasion, he thinks the artist, in a strikingly evocative phrase, had become a parable for the enkindling of a whole nation. In this ritual, moreover, a key role is played by the ninth candle known as the shamash, the servant, whose sole purpose is to light the 8 primary candles and thereby produce the great radiance that shines forth from the enkindled menorah. First, one candle. It is still dark and the solitary light looks gloomy. Then it finds a companion, then another, and yet another. The darkness must retreat. The young and the poor are the first to see the light. Then others join in. All those who love justice, truth, liberty, progress, humanity, and beauty. When all the candles are ablaze, everyone must stop in amazement and rejoicing at what has been wrought, and no office is more blessed than that of a servant of light. There the tale ends. Theodor Herzl was indeed a towering servant of the light, one whose indefatigable ardor as a statesman and patriot fueled the faith, the fire, the light of the burning bush, the great radiance that is the eternity of the Jewish people. Like the state he helped to create, his life and his accomplishments might well have been seen as another miracle, inspiring not only gratitude but amazement and rejoicing at what was thought by one man's prodigiously fecund and consequentially service in an office than which, he insisted, none was more blessed. Wow. That is interesting. All right, so let's go on to Chapter 9, Louis D. Brandeis. We're getting more closer to modern times, I think. Oh, but I think this steps back. In September 1654, 23 Jews set sail from Recife, Brazil, where the arrival of the Portuguese and of the Inquisition had made it impossible to practice Judaism. Intending to return to their origins in Europe, but captured mid-voyage by pirates, they gave themselves up for lost, until, in the words of a latter congregational history, God caused a Savior to arise unto them, the captain of a French ship, arrayed for battle, and he rescued them out of the hands of the outlaws, and conducted them until they reached the end of the inhabited earth, called New Holland. Once safely arrived in New Holland, better known as New Amsterdam, the refugees formed the first Jewish community in North America. From the start, they remained loyal to their faith, praying together, ensuring the availability of kosher meat, observing their holidays. The name they gave their congregation was Shirith Yisrael, the remnant of Israel. Today is not just the first, but also the oldest Jewish congregation in the land. On November 28, 1905, to mark the 250th anniversary of the arrival in America of these 23 Jews, a man named Louis Brandeis was asked to serve as a speaker at special commemorative gathering. Who was he and why him? Born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1856, the young Brandeis had attended Harvard Law School and subsequently built a Boston law firm known for its extraordinary impact on American jurisprudence and for its channeling of the law toward activist ends. By 1905, in his late 40s, he had come to embody the very essence of a successful achiever. One with a proven record of accomplishment at the highest level, who had also gained a significant measure of public influence and acclaim. In addition, as his biographer Melvin Urofsky writes in Louis D. Brandeis, A Life, a 2012 book, he also displayed the bearing, the character, and the outlook considered most desirable in any upper-class assimilated Jew. The word assimilated is key. At the event, Brandeis spoke not at all about religion. Rather, he undertook to claim the social fears of many concerning the recent inflow into America of masses of largely impoverished Jews from Eastern Europe. How might their presence adversely affect the status of Jews already well settled in the United States? The answer, Brandeis said, lay in teaching these new arrivals that they must shed all aspects of Jewishness that identified them as outsiders. For there was, he intoned, simply no place in America for hyphenated Americans. The phrase had been the coinage of then-President Theodore Roosevelt, a man well known to be friendly to Jews, and Brandeis went on to quote him further. There is room here for men of any race, of any creed, of any condition in life, but not for Protestant Americans or Catholic Americans or for German Americans, Irish Americans, Russian Americans. Or, as it was altogether unnecessary for Brandeis to add, for Jewish Americans. Indeed, 5 years later, Brandeis would make the same point even more sharply in asserting to a newspaper reporter that habits of living or of thought which tend to keep alive differences of origin in classifying men according to their religious beliefs are inconsistent with the American ideal of brotherhood and are disloyal. Interesting. And yet, only a few years afterwards, in 1914, Brandeis' approach to Jewish identity would seem to have made startling 180-degree turn. The immediate background was this. The war raging in Europe had rendered it impossible for the World Zionist Organization to keep its headquarters in Berlin. Key point. In America, where the numbers of Zionists had been achieving modest but real growth, The movement's leaders now made bold to ask Brandeis if he would agree to serve as chairman of their own newly established headquarters, dubbed the Provisional Executive Committee for General Zionist Affairs. His response, given his past remarks, was startling. While confessing a lack of any real acquaintance with either Zionist or Judaism, Brandeis not only accepted but wholeheartedly embraced the Zionist cause and all that it demanded. Gone now was the person who had insisted that a hyphenated identity was disloyal. For the new Brandeis, to be a Jew was to be beholden to one's people all over the world, and to be an American Jew was to be obligated to utilize one's freedom, wealth, and power for the good of that people. As he said in his acceptance speech to a gathering of his new comrades, for the Jew in America, at peace in a strong neutral country, these are momentous days pregnant with serious tasks. He will be called upon to raise in large part the relief funds that will be needed to alleviate the distress and repair the losses of the millions of our people who are now groaning under the pitiless exactions of war. He will be called upon to rescue the Jews in Palestine who have always looked to the diaspora for sustenance and who are now overwhelmed by want and anxieties. In these respects, we urge you to your fullest duty as Jews when the proper time is at hand. And so, who was Louis D. Brandeis? Much has been written about his conversion to Zionism and about the evolution of his overall approach to Jewish identity. In what follows, I seek to set his personal story in perspective by returning first to the story of American early Jews, the members of the community whose founding in 1654 Brandeis had been asked to commemorate a decade earlier, and to move forward from there by highlighting both striking similarities and striking contrasts between Brandeis and earlier prominent Jews. We may see patterns of behavior seamlessly adopted by generations before him, patterns long legitimized by the American experiment itself, and patterns long consistent with central tenets of Judaism. We begin with a man by the name of Jonas Phillips, a German Jew who in 1756, at the age of 20, disembarked in Charleston, South Carolina, before making his way to New York. There he married the 16-year-old Rebecca Mikado, a child of a former Marranos, who was destined to become one of the most celebrated Jewish women in the land. In 1776, when the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and the imminent arrival of the British troops in New York, Phillips, a stalwart of Congregation Shearith Israel, where Rebecca's father was then the spiritual leader, urged his fellow Jews to flee with him to Philadelphia. There he would soon help to build another synagogue by the name of Mikvah Israel, the Hope of Israel. Such was the fervor of Phillips' patriotic feelings for America that in a July 1776 letter to an acquaintance in Holland detailing the extraordinary events happening in the country, and especially in Philadelphia, the home of the Continental Congress that had just issued the Declaration of Independence, he enclosed a copy of that momentous document itself. And indeed, it was in keeping with the principles and the spirit of the Declaration that Jonas Phillips would himself become vociferous advocate for religious liberty, perhaps even the new nation's first open champion of the cause. In 1787, as the Constitutional Convention was meeting in Philadelphia, Phillips wrote to George Washington protesting the requirement that all holders of public office in Pennsylvania affirm their belief in the divine inspiration of the New Testament. This, he stated, was absolutely against the religious principle of the Jew, and it is against a Jew's conscience to take any such oath. He therefore urged Washington to ensure the inclusion of in the new Constitution of a guarantee that since all religious societies in the United States are on an equal footing, eligible candidates for office could, if elected, continue to remain true to the beliefs and practices of their particular faith, whatever that faith might be. Concerning Jews in particular, Phillips also boldly reminded the greatest general and most famous man in America that during the late contest with England, Jews have been foremost in aiding and assisting the states with their lives and fortunes they have supported the cause, and they have bravely fought and bled for liberty, a liberty that Phillips added a little cheekily, they cannot enjoy. Of course, Jonas Phillips was already free, freer than any of his brethren anywhere to observe his faith in the privacy of his home and in his synagogue. But for him, so long as Jews were not equally able to serve society without violating their conscience, they were not free enough. In a final gesture of pride, he listed at the top of the letter not only the secular but also the Hebrew date, an additional marker of his public as well as his private identity in the world's freest republic. Although the Constitution, created in September 1787, did not explicitly address the free exercise of religion, it did ban all religious tests for federal office. Soon after, the free exercise of religion would become the centerpiece of the First Amendment. And according to the legal historian Michael McConnell, the very first instance of a religious liberty issued arising after the passage of the First Amendment would involve none other than Jonas Phillips himself, who, subpoenaed to testify in a court case on a Saturday, had been fined for refusing to appear on the grounds that he was observing the Jewish Sabbath. To this day, religious liberty, its definitions, its forms, its scopes, and its limits, its constitutional status, the role of government in protecting it, its uses and abuses, is an issue that has continued to absorb the attention of American courts and legislatures up to the highest levels, and to marshal the energies of religious thinkers, defenders, and critics. All the while, it remains a bedrock of American democracy and the American way of life. That, to my mind, is reason enough to regard Jonas Phillips as the first truly American Jew. That is, one who understood that freedom not only allowed, but also, in a sense, obliged Jews fully to embrace their faith both in America and in Judaism, and also, when necessary, to remind America of what its doctrine of rights has conferred on all its citizens equally. In other words, by refusing to amputate his Jewishness from his identity, Jonas Phillips was the first proud, hyphenated American. In the early 19th century, a second hyphenated American would amplify and extend the message of the first hyphenated American, and would do so in a way that eerily anticipated the emergence a century later of Louis Brandeis. His name was Mordecai Manuel Noah, 1785 to 1851. And he was, strikingly, Jonas Phillips' grandson. He was also, as President James Madison, ambassador to Tunis, the first Jewish appointee in American history to a high-level federal position. As serially and sometimes simultaneously a diplomat, a journalist, a newspaper editor, a politician, and a judge, as a playwright and as a spokesperson for the Jewish community, he was altogether the most prominent American Jew in the first half of the 19th century. A full portrait must regrettably also register his lack of support for the American abolitionist movement. In 1818, then 33 years old, Noah, already one of the city's best-known Jews, was invited to address his fellow worshippers at the inauguration of Congregation Shearith Israel's new building in Lower Manhattan. To this day, his speech remains one of the most fascinating written records of early American Jewish life, and an eloquent expression of a Jewish statesman worldview. The address can be best understood as 3 documents in one, with each installment building to the next. The first consists of a rhapsodic paean to America, our country, the brightest example of universal tolerance, of liberty, true religion, and good faith, as the best and only future home of the Jewish diaspora. It ends until the Jews can recover their ancient rights and dominions and take their rank among the governments of the earth. This is their chosen country. But to all of the blessings, there was added for Noah a more worrisome aspect of the American Jewish experience, the exposition of which serves as a sobering theme of his speech's second section. Noting that unprecedented opportunities for assimilation offered by American freedom, he focuses on the consequent temptation for Jews to ignore their duty to remain loyal to their faith of the fathers. America was indeed the God-given opportunity for Jews to remain both a part of and somewhat apart from society, but only if they would exercise self-discipline. Otherwise, the very blessing that ensured the flourishing of Judaism in America would end by undermining it. Precisely in the warm embrace of American freedom and equality, he foresaw what a century later would have become the religious undoing of hundreds of thousands of American Jews. But if this was the great challenge presented by America, the land that was the only choice for the Jews of the diaspora, what then? The answer is given in the third part of the address. Empowered as they were to a degree unmatched anywhere else in the world, American Jews, Noah argued, must also strive for a larger and more sweeping goal, namely a return to Zion and the reestablishment of Jewish government in their ancient dominion. And never, Noah declaimed, were there the prospects for such a restoration more brilliant than at present. The 7 million or so Jews in the world possessed among them more wealth, activity, influence, and talents than any body of people of their number on earth. They were therefore capable of forming an army to bring 100,000 men into the field for just this grand national purpose. He concluded, "Let us then hope that the day is not far distant when, from the operation of liberal and enlightened measures, we may look forward that country where our people will have established a mild, just, and honorable government, accredited by the world and admired by all good men." To my knowledge, there was nothing like this statement by any Jewish leader in Europe at that time. With the founders of the modern European Zionism still many decades in the offing, here came an American Jew asserting that the world Jewish community had the wherewithal and the capability to come together and to put together a state, an army, a country. What is more, Noah clearly believed that not only American Jews, but America itself would play a central role in this grand enterprise. We have no record of how this address was received by Noah's immediate audience, but he then published it as a pamphlet, sent it to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, neither of whom was then still in office, and received replies from both. Jefferson's missive, now in the collection of the Yeshiva University Museum, is a polished recapitulation of the former president's liberal beliefs on the subject of religious liberty. By contrast, John Adams' letter to Noah were devoid of political sophistication, but also refreshingly free of evasion. Acknowledging grateful receipt of Noah's pamphlet, he wrote, "I wish your nation be admitted to all the privileges of citizens in every country of the world. This country has done much. I wish it may do more, and annul every narrow idea in religion, government, and commerce." In signing, Adams wrote, "I am, sir, though a stranger, with much esteem, your humble and obliged servant." Unsolicited, this American founder and former president had gone out of his way to reflect on how the entire civilized world was indebted to the Jews for monotheism. Although he wrote Wits and Philosophers, by which he meant free thinkers like Voltaire and probably Jefferson, might have little regard for Judaism, for him the Jewish influence on humanity was of paramount importance. If Noah in his address had stressed how welcoming America was and would be to Judaism, Adams explained how that welcome came to be, namely from the fact that not only he, but so many of the other American founders were of like sentiment. Adams' most fascinating statement was yet to come. A year later, Noah would send both men and memoir of his travels abroad. Jefferson's reply was perfunctory. Adam again, by contrast, effusively wrote the following: "Dear Sir, I have to thank you for another valuable publication. I have been so pleased with it that I wish you had continued your travels into Syria, Judea, and Jerusalem. If I were to let my imagination loose, I should wish you had been a member of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. Nay, further, I could find it in my heart to wish that you had been the head of 100,000 Israelites, and marching with them into Judea and making a conquest of that country, and restoring your nation to the dominion of it. For I really wish the Jews, again, the idea of an independent nation. Emphasis added. Wow. Adams typically then went on to reflect untactfully on whether political independence might also enable the Jews to jettison some of the peculiarities that set them apart as a faith. Such musings aside, however, the letter remains extraordinary, marking the first time in modern history that a non-Jewish statesman would forthrightly endorse the idea of a Jewish return, a Jewish army, and a Jewish state. This brings us to 1825 and to the best-known episode in Noah's career. Pursuing his proto-Zionist ideas as endorsed by Adams, he embarked on a widely imaginative campaign to bring all of world Jewry to America itself, where, in a place of his specific choosing and preparation, they would form a kind of self-sufficient colony. Not content with words alone, he and several investors purchased the major part of Grand Island, New York, a large island surrounded by the waters of the Niagara River, not far from then frontier town to Buffalo. Wow, so now we get to see how New York was, especially Grand Island, where you got, With the approval of a committee of the state legislature, they renamed the island Ararat after the ancient mountain where the biblical Noah's Ark came to rest. For the modern Noah, this up-to-date Ararat was intended to provide an asylum, a place of refuge from the harsh social environments that was common experience of millions of Jews all over the world. On the third day of the Hebrew month of Tishri, 5586, September 15, 1825, a grand ceremony attended by some Jews and many Christians took place in Buffalo, marking the dedication of a huge foundation stone that can still be seen today in Grand Island's town hall. Noah then delivered the Ararat Address, as it came to be called. Here he set forth his vision, inviting all Jews from European West and from the Middle East, from Africa and from China, to come to Ararat and there constitute a Jewish government. To be sure, he announced that this was not a long-term solution. Rather, in his new and separate American colony, Jewish immigrants and refugees from less modern cultures could truly experience the blessing of America while helping to set in motion their return to the Holy Land. And here we can discern the political and cultural logic behind such an otherwise bizarre-seeming experiment. In their own colony, Jews would remain protected from the temptation of assimilation, loyal to the faith of their fathers, at the same time experiencing the best that America had to offer. They could educate themselves in the workings of political institutions and thereby ultimately qualify themselves to direct the energies of a just and honorable government in the land of the patriarchs. America, Noah argued, was nothing less than a divinely ordained opportunity for the Jews of the world to seize control of their own destiny. The Almighty, who has covered us with the shield of paternal love, has given us moral agents by which his divine aid we are to effect our own deliverance. The time has emphatically arrived to do something calculated to benefit ourselves, and we must commence the work in a country free from ignoble prejudices and legal disqualifications. Noah concluded his Ararat address by seamlessly segueing between his proto-Zionism and his bedrock Americanism. Let us not seek, he said, the errors of other faiths, but calmly and peaceably pursue our own. Let us respect and assist all religions which acknowledge God, and whose principles are justice and mercy. Between two good men professing different faiths, no differences exist. Both are born equal, both have a right to worship the Almighty, each in his own way. The road to honor should be open to both. It may be worth pointing out in this connection that in the America of that day, Ararat was not quite so peculiar or eccentric a project as it might seem today. In fact, as the scholar Robert Gordis notes, 19th century America harbored a large number of freestanding settlement projects and covenantal undertakings, all motivated by the most varied religious, cultural, and social purposes imaginable, each seeking to preserve its unique identity, and many looking to the unspoiled wilderness as the destined site of their particular venture. Against that background, Ararat loses some of, if not much of, its particular character. Nevertheless, Noah's widely publicized plan was ridiculed by Western European Jewish leaders and intellectuals, including eminent rabbis who maintained that the impulse to force an end of the diaspora ran contrary to the teachings of the Torah, and that given how much better life had become for the newly emancipated Jews in Western Europe, there was no longer a need to flee to America. As for the Jews of Eastern Europe, for the most part, they never even became apprised of Ararat's existence, as the authorities in that region took Noah's plan quite serious and made sure that their Jews never found out about it. Nor did American Jews themselves respond to Noah's dream of a Jewish colony that would at once foster Jewish freedom and Jewish pride, prevent assimilation, and launch a Jewish return to the Holy Land. For the most part, they either rejected or ignored it entirely. Indeed, relatively few American Jews would ever prove interested in wrestling openly with the issues of how to be at once fully American and faithfully Jewish. To the contrary, many, if not most, would come to embrace America's promise of freedom, not as a means of bolstering their faith, but as permission to quietly set it aside. Yeah, that's about the time you had the birth of the what do they call it? The not the conservative movement, but the Jewish Anyways, we are now able to move forward in time and back to Louis Brandeis, born 31 years after the Ararat address. In his childhood home in Louisville, as Melvin Eufrosky describes it, his parents Adolph and Frederica observed no Sabbath and experienced no Yom Kippur. To the contrary, they predicated their way of life on the general assumption that religious particularism interfered with one's humanity. Eufrosky delineates the nature of their Jewishness, or rather the lack thereof. A thriving Jewish community existed in Louisville in mid-century, but Adolph and Frederica apparently had little or nothing to do with it. They observed what one scholar has called the secular Christianity of the United States, and sent each other Christmas gifts and cards. As for religion itself, Frederica wrote in her memoirs, "I do not believe that the sins can be expiated by going to divine service and observing this or that formula. I believe that only goodness and truth and conduct that is humane and self-sacrificing towards those who need us can bring God nearer to us, and that our errors can only be atoned for by acting in a more kindly spirit." She deliberately did not impart to her children any formal religious teachings, since such doctrines, she believed, could be argued away. Rather, she wanted them to imbibe a pure spirit and the highest ideals as to morals and love. It is therefore unsurprising that the child of such parents would acquire no sense of his own Jewishness. As he put it in his acceptance speech to the assembled Zionists in 1914, "Throughout the long years which represent my own life, I have been to a great extent separated from Jews. I am very ignorant in things Jewish." But that was not entirely true. Throughout his youth, he had benefited from his close relations with one Jewish role model, a very strong one. This was his mother's brother, Louis Dembitz, who lived between 1833 and 1907, a learned lawyer who would so profoundly inspire his nephew's own choice of a legal career as to impel him to substitute Dembitz for his given middle name of David. A study of the senior Dembitz's life reveals him to be an American of profoundly hyphenated identity, admired by his fellow Americans for his integrity, his civic engagement, and also for his fierce open dedication to his Jewish faith. After his death, an appreciation published not in a Jewish newspaper but in the Louisville Courier-Journal paid tribute not only to Dembitz's career in law but also to his strict piety and Jewish observance. Business and pleasure never interfered with the lawyer-scholar's religious obligations. No duty was ever pressing enough to keep him away from his little church. He was a member of the congregation Anshe Sephardim, which worships on First Street just south of Walnut on the Sabbath day. Questions of theology always interested him keenly, and he early in life made a careful study of the Talmud in the original Aramaic tongue. If by chance the rabbi of the congregation failed to appear, Mr. Dembitz willingly and eagerly conducted the services. He ever was extremely orthodox in his views, and he entertained no sympathy for reform movements in his church rituals. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, early 18th century, you had the reform movement pushing for assimilation. Unlike Manuel Noah, Dembitz had also joined his Jewishness with a dedication to fighting slavery. As one of the founders of the Republican Party, he remarked of its 1860 nominee for the presidency that of all the Israelites throughout the United States, there was none who more thoroughly filled the ideal of what a true descendant of Abraham ought to be than Abraham Lincoln. In more ways than one, Dembitz was thus a true 19th century incarnation of Jonas Phillips, and like Phillips, he was known for his particular dedication to the Sabbath. The Courier-Journal, citing his fidelity to rabbinic law, helpfully offered a detail to change the condition of a material object for a useful purpose constituted work. In Dembitz's opinion, he would not sign his own name on Saturday, which of course was his Sabbath, nor would he so much as open a letter. For his part, his nephew Louis Brandeis would later similarly recall the singular impact upon him of his uncle's Sabbath observance. In the home of my parents there was no Jewish Sabbath, nor in my home, but I recall vividly the joy and awe with which my uncle Louis Dembitz welcomed the arrival of the day and the piety with which he observed it. I remember the extra delicacies, lighting of candles, prayers over a cup of wine, and quaint chants, and Uncle Louis poring over the books most of the day. I remember more peculiarly an elusive something about him which was spoken of as Sabbath peace, and which, later, Addison, in which he speaks of stealing a day out of life to live. Of course, this same Louis Dembitz would very clearly be far from his nephew's mind in 1905, when the latter was inveighing against hyphenated identity, or when in 1910 he would characterize resistance to assimilation as disloyal. But then came 1912, when the nephew's Cape Cod vacation home was visited by the journalist Jacob DeHaas, by this time the editor of the Boston Jewish Advocate. DeHaas was a dedicated Zionist and, as we saw in the previous chapter, had served as secretary to Theodore Herzl. But the purpose of his visit now was only to interview the prominent attorney concerning the most anodyne of subjects, insurance law. Following the interview, and his host was driving him to the train station, DeHaas offhandedly inquired whether Brandeis might be related to Louis Dembitz, whom he, DeHaas, had come to know as a fellow Zionist, something seemingly catalyzed by the mention of an uncle who had passed away in 1907, stirred within Brandeis in his book Israel in the Mind of America, 1983. The late writer Peter Gross summarizes of the significance of the moment. He was a noble Jew, DeHaas remembers saying about Dembitz, and the remark caught Brandeis up short. What did he mean by that? And what was the man Herzl like, whom DeHaas had served in his younger days? Brandeis turned the car around, urged DeHaas back home for lunch and more talk. From this conversation on August 13, 1912, is traditionally the date Brandeis' conversion to Zionism. Thus did Louis Dembitz, dead 5 years, trigger a sort of soul-searching. So you see how Hashem works. 5 years after his death, somebody's soul-searching, in his nephew. While the nephew would never embrace Jewish religious observance, the uncle became the perfect exemplar of his evolving notion of American identity, which was also profoundly influenced by the work of sociologist and social philosopher Horace Callan, who lived between 1882 and 1974. According to Callan's concept of cultural pluralism, differing members of society could unite around certain core principles without discarding their differences, and could thereby add a richness to society itself. Callan's notion of cultural pluralism is also well characterized in a phrase by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks as integration without assimilation. Urofsky describes the impact of Callan's teachings on Brandeis, who came to understand that diversity need not be detrimental in a democratic society, providing that all groups subscribe to a common set of ethics, to a common set of ethical and social principles. By intertwining Jewish Zionism, idealism, and as complementary to and supportive of American democracy, Brandeis undercut the claim that Zionism was either inconsistent or antithetical to American ideals. To the contrary, the desire for liberty that had characterized the earliest Americans and had shaped their nation's destiny had been reborn in a movement that allowed Jews to live in freedom in a land of their own. A dedication to America, then, did not in any way preclude other dedications. Far from it. In fact, Brandeis came to believe that anyone devoted to the American idea of freedom should also seek freedom for his or her brethren overseas. Urofsky eloquently explains Brandeis's perspective. One believed in freedom, justice, and democracy, not just in one place for one group, but everywhere for all people. And in working for these goals, one demonstrated the greatest love of America. Every Irish American who contributed towards advancing home rule was a better man and a better American for the sacrifices he made. Brandeis asserted, and the same would be said of Jews, in joining together to build a free and democratic homeland for their brethren in Palestine, they would be giving the best possible proof of their loyalty to the United States. Brandeis' Zionist journey, along with his engagement in Jewish statesmanship, was only beginning. A staunch political supporter of Woodrow Wilson, he may have been surprised when he was not offered a cabinet position after Wilson's victory in the 1912 presidential election. But a reward was soon to follow. In 1916, Wilson signaled his gratitude for Jewish support of the Democratic ticket by nominating Brandeis to the Supreme Court of the United States, the first Jew to be so honored. The appointment was hardly free of controversy, or even of sly charges that Brandeis' Jewish turn was itself nothing but a self-serving ploy covering naked personal ambition with a show of piety. Thus, the former president, William Howard Taft, who had been seeking the court seat for himself, would cite in a letter that the reported view of one Jewish philanthropist that there is among the leading Jews a great feeling of antagonism towards Brandeis because his present superlative and extreme Judaism is a plant of very late growth. He, Taft's source, says that Brandeis was no Jew until he was rejected by Wilson as Attorney General. Since that time, Brandeis has adopted Zionism, favors the New Jerusalem, and has metaphorically been recircumcised. There is more along the same scurrilous lines coming from Taft, a pillar of American cultural rectitude. You know what? I think that's probably a good part to stop for today, because I think we got too many pages. I'm not going to be able to finish this chapter today. So probably, yeah. We'll leave this for Monday, and we'll be back for more of the wonderful book, Providence and Power. We're talking about Brandeis. Excellent stuff as far as history, especially the stuff leading up to today. Helps you understand the building and the rise of the Jewish state in the world view. So very interesting read for sure. I think we still got another couple of days at least. I might be able to knock it off in one more day. Not quite sure. So we definitely have at least one more full day, if not a bit more after that. So let's leave this for Monday. And if anybody's got suggestions that they want for us to go into next, if I can find it in a Kindle edition, I'd be glad to read a request. So please, if you have a request, feel free to write it down in the chat, and I will do my best to see if it's available. But that would probably be no sooner than Tuesday. But yeah, so let's call it a day for today. So until Monday, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom kind of weekend. And yeah, take care for now. Bye.